Hey everyone! Tonight we're plunging headfirst into the unglamorous, stomach-churning, absolutely brutal reality of life in Tudor Britain. Forget the romanticized castles, noble banquets, and polite curtsies. You're about to meet a world of smoke-choked rooms, chamber pots flung out of windows, and fashion choices that could quite literally kill you. Before we dive in, take a moment to like the video if you enjoy immersive history, subscribe if you want to stick around, and drop a comment letting me know where you're tuning in from and what time it is. I want to see if anyone's braving this nightmare in real time with me. Now, imagine your eyes flicker open. Congratulations, you survived the night. That's already more than many in Tudor Britain could say. But don't celebrate too loudly. The smells of last night's fire and yesterday's dinner, or what passed for it, are still clinging to your lungs, and your throat tastes like wet wool. You're lying on something called a mattress, a lumpy sack of straw that hasn't been changed since Henry VIII had knees, and it smells like a bizarre cocktail of mildew, goat, and existential failure. Somewhere in the room, a cat is moving. Is it yours? Who knows? Does it have fleas? Definitely. Are you sharing your bedroom with other humans who snore, sweat, and cough like livestock? Absolutely. Welcome to your new reality. As sunlight, or something vaguely resembling light, leaks through the greasy, oiled parchment of your window, your nostrils are immediately assaulted by the unmistakable aroma of your roommate emptying the chamber pot into the street. With luck, someone might yell, "Guard low," as it arcs through the morning air like a foul comet. If not, congratulations, you've received the Elizabethan version of a surprise water balloon. And that's just the beginning. Your back pops, your knees crackle like kindling, and you remember that there is no such thing as central heating. Sure, there's a fire, but it's about as effective as a candle in a wind tunnel. Smoke isn't politely contained by a chimney, it is moved in, unpacked, and taken over your room like an uninvited guest with bad manners. By now, you're probably wondering, how did anyone survive this daily assault on senses, patience, and dignity? Tonight, we'll explore the gritty, chaotic, often disgusting details of Tudor life. The living conditions, the food, the fashion, the labor, the laws, and yes, even the ways people somehow carved out joy, connection, and culture in the middle of all this misery. Buckle up, dim the lights, maybe fan yourself gently for that soft background hum, and let's take a step into Tudor Britain, a world that's going to challenge everything you thought you knew about history. One foul smell, one shattered tooth, one hazardous street at a time. Ah, the sound of morning, not the chirping of birds or the soft rustle of leaves in the wind. No, in Tudor Britain, the first thing you hear when you wake up is the damp, creaking sound of a straw mattress beneath you, shifting as your aching body tries to find some form of comfort. That lovely bed you've been calling home for the past, well, however long you've been here, is a half-rotten sack of straw that smells like mildew and desperation. You're supposed to be resting after your long night, but the truth is, you're lying in what could only be described as a sleeping accident. The mattress is not really a mattress, it's a heap of straw that's seen more medieval history than a textbook. For all you know, the straw hasn't changed since the time of Henry VIII's knees, or probably since he last visited your town. After all, luxury wasn't exactly in the cards for your class, and this mattress is a cruel joke played on you by nature. As you slowly pry your eyes open, blinking against the dim light sneaking in through the oiled parchment window, seriously, the light isn't quite sunshine. It's more like thick, sickly glow from whatever's left of the day. The first sensation you encounter is a particularly unwelcome one. It's wet. Your pillow is damp with sweat from the night before. Great. Just great. This is your life now. Wet hair, sweaty neck, and an uncomfortably cold sensation where your body and the straw mattress have fused into a symbiotic disaster. Now, you know what else you'll encounter when you wake up? A lovely, comforting aroma of rotting flesh, excrement. It's not entirely clear, but that faint smell is definitely there. It's the kind of smell that clings to your clothes and your skin like it's your new, permanent fragrance. Ah, yes, that's the sweet scent of squalor, my friend. And don't worry, you're not the only one who gets to enjoy it. Your entire family, plus anyone else who's decided to take refuge in your overcrowded, poorly ventilated room, shares the privilege of living in this olfactory nightmare. No privacy, no space, and most definitely, no comfort. Not even a corner to call your own. The room you're in is shared with everyone in the household, maybe even a few extra guests. It's a prison of sorts, only with more goats. The entire family, plus the occasional animal, is packed in here like sardines. There's a man snoring next to you, your cousin tossing and turning in her sleep. A goat munches on something in the corner, probably a rat, and you just hope it's not nibbling at your belongings. And then, the real beauty of Tudor Britain begins. That moment you realize you've survived the night, but it's far from a victory moment. It's more of a grim acknowledgement that you've managed to make it through another night in the worst of conditions. And yet your day has just begun. A fun twist in the journey of life, if you ask me. Your legs feel like lead. Your joints are as stiff as your poor straw bedding. And every part of your body is crying out in protest. You survived the night. But now comes the next adventure. Getting up. That moment you stretch and hear your back crack like an overcooked chicken. Your knees, oh God. Your knees are reminding you of just how much luxury you're not experiencing. You barely manage to sit up, wincing from the aches and pains that come with the privilege of being alive in Tudor Britain. You shuffle to your feet, trying to avoid stepping on something. Gross. Your room, a veritable breeding ground for discomfort, is littered with what? Things? You're not quite sure what they are, mice, rats, or maybe it's just leftover debris from someone else's dreams of grandeur, or the remains of last night's rat fighting pit. No matter what it is, stepping in it is not ideal, but that's life here. Every step is a gamble. Do you step on something warm? Squishy? Oh, the thrill. Will you survive the next 3 minutes of your life? Stay tuned. As you groggily stumble to the corner of the room where the chamber pot resides, yes, you read that correctly. The chamber pot is in your room because privacy is, of course, overrated. You can't help but think about your day. This is the reality of Tudor Britain. You have no modern plumbing to speak of. Shocking. The chamber pot, ever present, sits in the corner. And it's exactly as charming as you're imagining, filled to the brim with someone else's excrement. The lovely stench wafts through the room and invites a whole new level of morning delight. Of course, you have no real choice in the matter. So, here's the process. Take the pot, carefully dump it out the window, if you're lucky enough to avoid drenching your neighbor, and pray to whichever god might be listening that you don't get a surprise splashback from the debris you've just discarded. Maybe it'll hit you in the face, maybe it won't. The suspense adds to the charm, doesn't it? This is, undeniably, the reality of Tudor Britain. There is no sanitation system, and there sure as hell isn't anything like a modern convenience. It's just you, your chamber pot, and the cold, unforgiving reality of life in the 16th century. And for those who aren't so lucky as to get the first dumping rights, well, good luck. You can smell what's coming. You feel it in your very bones. Now let's talk about those little household hazards you'll definitely get to enjoy. We've got rats who are officially the worst roommates imaginable. They don't care about your personal space, your sleep schedule, or whether you like to think of your belongings as yours. No, the rats are here to stay, and they're quite content making a mess of whatever crumbs are left behind. Fleas? Oh, let me tell you about fleas. They're not just an inconvenience. They're your constant companions. They've set up shop in your clothes, in your hair, and every time you scratch that lovely little bite on your neck, another one pops up like a guest you didn't invite but who's here to stay. The fleas love you. In fact, they might be the only thing in Tudor Britain that actually finds you appealing, and the feeling is definitely not mutual. But wait, it doesn't end there. No, there's always a little something extra in Tudor Britain's charm offensive. The smoke, the thick, pervasive smoke that stings your eyes and settles into your lungs like a permanent, unwelcome houseguest. Your family may try to keep a fire burning because heaven forbid you live in a world without heat, but it's not like you're getting any central heating. That fire is as much of a suggestion as the chimney in your room. When it does work, the smoke fills your room, and you breathe in the smell of burning wood, wet cloth, and whatever else you can't quite identify. And let's not forget the rats again. Why? Because they're everywhere. They skitter beneath the floorboards, feast on the crumbs of your supper, and make their presence known every single day. The sound of them is your new soundtrack. Squeak, scrabble, squeak. It's enough to make you question whether the rats are the ones really in charge here. This is Tudor living. There's no end to the discomforts, no soft blankets of comfort to wrap yourself in. There's no sense of safety or solace. There's no warm shower waiting for you at the end of the day, or even a clean mattress to sleep on. The only thing constant is the stench of reality, the pungent reminder that survival itself is a miracle. And yet, somehow, you make it through each day, wondering if the next morning will smell just a little better, just a little cleaner. As you slowly peel yourself from the straw mattress, the realization hits you. You're still alive. It's both a triumph and a tragedy. You're not dead from the rat plague, the constant smoke inhalation, or just the fact that the mattress you're sleeping on looks like it was designed to make you regret every decision that led you here. But somehow, you're still here, struggling to get out of bed. You move to sit up, but then there's the instant sensation of the straw crunching beneath you. The straw itself, crammed into a rough sack, is somehow both surprisingly sharp and strangely soft in ways that defy logic. You shift your weight, trying to adjust your position. Maybe you could move just a little bit to the right and the pain will go away? Ha, nice try. It's like trying to adjust to the worst pillow ever, one that doesn't just lack comfort but actively antagonizes you with every movement. It's hard to imagine how anyone could possibly sleep on this. Yet, here you are, contemplating how Henry VIII would have probably enjoyed the chance to sleep on a bed this luxurious. After all, it's a far cry from a bed of feathers and down if you're lucky. You'll have a few days where the bed doesn't smell too musty. But that's not the reality. The straw, which you proudly call your mattress, has been there for so long it might as well be an ancient artifact. If you could peek beneath, you'd find the bottom caked with the remnants of past lives, old food crumbs, spilled ale, possibly the ghost of a rat that wandered in here months ago, but hasn't been able to escape. You've tried to fluff it up before, in the hopeful but futile effort to make it more comfortable, but fluffing the straw only adds to the problem, sending dust and bits of hay flying into your face like tiny medieval grenades of discomfort. And don't even get started on the smell. It smells like old cheese and wet goats, which you've now come to associate with a sense of home. And just when you think it can't get worse, you're hit by another realization. The mattress isn't the worst part of your sleeping arrangement. No, that honor belongs to your bedfellows, the human, animal, and insect variety. Let's take a quick inventory. You've got your family, of course, snoring loudly in various corners, smelling like a mixture of sweat, soot, and unwashed bodies. They're so crammed in here, it's less like a room and more like a human stew. And what about that pesky goat? Ah yes, the goat. It seems to have decided that your room is now its home, and it's perfectly fine with nibbling on your belongings when it's bored. Great. Let's not forget about the rats again, of course. They're here, joining in the lovely bedshare experience. Those guys are always moving about, scurrying under the floorboards, possibly nibbling on the edges of your shoes or even your fingers when you least expect it. You might find a little rat nest under your bed one day, and let's be honest, you'd probably rather not know. But you will. It will be there like an unwelcome surprise package you didn't sign up for. There's a moment where you half-heartedly wish you could just go back to sleep and escape it all. Maybe you could stay in bed forever, right? But as the truth slowly dawns upon you, you can't, and this will likely be the situation until you either find a better bed or, actually die in your sleep. So you face the next challenge, getting out of bed. And that involves moving your body, which, well, it's just as painful as it sounds. You attempt to stand, but the moment you try to shuffle towards the door, you remember the chamber pot. If there's one thing that makes your morning ritual more interesting, and by interesting, we mean utterly horrific, it's the fact that the chamber pot is just right there in the corner of your room. The aroma is a constant companion, lingering in the air like a cruel joke you can't escape. It's a distinct smell, really, the smell of human waste and failure. If you're feeling optimistic, it might smell faintly of bread or some other half-remembered comfort. If you're unlucky, it could have been recently used by someone who clearly doesn't understand the concept of being discreet. This isn't a bathroom where you can have a moment of privacy. No, this is medieval life, baby. The chamber pot is your one-stop shop for everything. It's not a private experience. It's shared, communal pleasure, and by pleasure, I mean no one's really enjoying it. You have to get up, make the long, slow trek to the pot, and prepare for the lovely experience of dumping it out the window. Ah yes, the window. Your new, favorite friend for all the wrong reasons. You know what's coming next, the task of pouring the waste out into the street, and praying to God that you don't end up on the receiving end of a surprise water balloon to the face from your fellow townsfolk. It's a classic moment in your day-to-day life. There's always that chance you could have an awkward run-in with a neighbor, or worse, your own family. Could you avoid stepping into the unspeakable mess beneath you? Or will you end up finding yourself not so gracefully tripping over something that might resemble, say, a rat carcass? You pray for survival. You pray for a decent, hygienic moment. But instead, you get the sweet ritual of taking that disgusting chamber pot and praying that no one is standing underneath the window when it gets dumped out. You've gotten lucky before, but you know there's no real avoiding the potential disaster of accidentally spitting chamber pots into someone's face. You always take a moment to pray before you pour. A good 10 seconds of hope that you don't end up covered in village juice this time. If you've ever dreamed of cozy living, Tudor Britain will surely knock those dreams out of your head. In this life, cozy means rats, fleas, and unspeakable smells, or as I like to call it, luxury. Every corner of your home seems to be a battleground of discomfort, where nature seems to have run rampant. No matter where you turn, there's a constant presence of pests, both human and animal, that you're forced to share this space with. Rats, for instance, are not just cute little animals scurrying about, they're everywhere. In the walls, under your bed, in the rafters above, and yes, sometimes even in your hair. You didn't know it, but you just felt it, right? The squeaks and scrabbling sounds they make at night are enough to make anyone feel like they're losing their minds. But it's not just the rats. Fleas are a plague upon your very existence. They never let up, relentlessly biting your skin with the ferocity of their medieval ancestry. Those tiny little terrors are your constant companions. You try to ignore them, but their biting itch is a reminder of your station in life. They're there. They're coming for you. And you'll scratch until there's blood. Fun, right? And let's not forget about the smoke. It's omnipresent. Every single moment in your day is clouded by the thick, acrid smoke that swirls around, never giving you a break from the suffocating atmosphere. You try to open the window to air things out, but all that really does is let in more rats and more unpleasant smells. But somehow, the smoke has wormed its way into your lungs, and you find yourself coughing more than you care to admit. You could go outside for fresh air, but let's be honest, outside smells like human waste, rotting meat, and animals. In your sleepy stupor, you might think about other things, about your future, about how you long for something resembling comfort. You dream of fluffy pillows, warm blankets, and clean clothes. But alas, Tudor Britain doesn't deal in such luxuries. Here, your most intimate companions are the rats, the smoke, and the fleas that bite you relentlessly. This is your life. There's no such thing as self-care when you live in Tudor Britain, especially when it comes to the harrowing task of maintaining your teeth. In this era, brushing your teeth doesn't involve minty freshness or even basic hygiene. It's a chaotic experiment in what might work to keep your mouth from rotting too quickly. If you're lucky, you have a rag. And if you're unlucky, you have soot, salt, or twigs to clean your teeth with. Let's just say that brushing in the 16th century was closer to an ancient ritual of survival than anything resembling modern dental care. Imagine waking up, your breath already smelling like the aftermath of a burnt barn, and you grab your trusty rag, a cloth that probably hasn't seen any soap or water in weeks, if ever, and dip it in salt. Salt. Not to season your food, but to rub against your already aching gums in a pathetic attempt to scrub the filth off. You can feel the gritty salt scrubbing against your teeth, which feel more like rough stone than the smooth enamel you're used to dreaming about. The rag barely touches your teeth without shredding into pieces, leaving you with more dental waste than actual cleanliness. But if you're feeling particularly lucky, and by lucky, I mean having just a sliver of hope left in your soul, you can try chewing on twigs. Yes, twigs. Sometimes they're from a mint plant, which sounds somewhat refreshing, but other times they're simply branches of whatever tree you find within arm's reach. You gnaw on the ends of these twigs, which feel more like rough, jagged stakes than anything resembling a pleasant experience. And just when you think things couldn't get worse, there's the issue of your breath, a sharp, bitter, foul-smelling concoction of the day's last meal, mixed with a weird metallic tang from your decaying teeth. You try to get used to it. After all, everyone else around you is in the same boat, gritting their teeth literally as they deal with their own decaying mouths. In fact, some of the wealthier folks might have it worse than you, their sugar-laden diets causing more damage than your bread-based one. The rich can afford candied figs and sugar in their tea, both of which rot teeth faster than the poorest peasant could imagine. So while you're rubbing soot into your gums, the upper crust is gnashing away at their own rotten teeth covered in a sugary glaze, of course. And when that nagging toothache gets too bad to ignore, forget about a dentist's office or even a simple painkiller. You're at the mercy of the village barber surgeon, whose idea of a tooth extraction is yanking it out with pliers. Don't expect any anesthesia either. The most you might get is a little swig of ale if you're lucky. There's no numbing, no gentle handling, just a crack, a sudden pop, and an eruption of pain that sends your screams bouncing off the walls. The worst part? You're likely to keep the tooth. That's right. You'll be wearing your own teeth-like fashion accessories, strung together as necklaces, or perhaps gifted to a saint in some twisted act of medieval devotion. After all, what else is there to do when your body's so tortured by the realities of the time? When you do find yourself in need of more substantial medical attention, say, a life-threatening wound, or ailing health, the experience is one of medieval horror. The practice of medicine in Tudor Britain wasn't really a matter of finding a doctor. It was more about finding whoever happened to be closest. Enter the world of barber surgeons, the unfortunate souls tasked with doing everything from cutting your hair to amputating your limbs. But don't be fooled, they don't really know much about cleanliness or sterility. They're not trained medical professionals. They're just people who can hold a sharp instrument and, for whatever reason, are trusted to poke, cut, or even bleed you. Picture this. You're at your wit's end, feverish from a cut on your leg that started to fester and turn an unpleasant shade of dark purple. You've tried every folk remedy your grandmother passed down: garlic, honey, even cow dung, don't ask. But nothing seems to work. So now, you have no choice but to see the village barber surgeon. You walk into his humble shop, where the smell of rum and blood fills the air. He has a small collection of instruments, razors, scalpels, and most importantly, his pliers for teeth, limbs, or anything else that needs to be removed. And don't forget the leeches. He'll often use them to purge the evil humors from your body. What are evil humors, you ask? Well, don't think about it too much, because the Tudor view of medicine is one that's all about balance. Your body contains 4 humors: blood, phlegm, black bile, and yellow bile. If one of them gets out of balance, you'll start feeling sick. How do you fix that? Bloodletting. The barber surgeon will open a vein and let all the bad blood pour out, because, obviously, if your blood's diseased, removing a little bit of it should magically make everything better. And if bloodletting doesn't work, there's always leeches. They'll suck out the badness from your body, somehow purging you of your ailments. Never mind that they're probably introducing more disease in the process. And don't get me started on the tools of the trade. Everything is reused: your bloodied bandages, the dirty scalpels, the rainwater that was used to sterilize the instruments, and it's all done in the most unsanitary environment possible. No gloves, no clean sheets, and certainly no painkillers. The procedure is as painful as it sounds. If you're lucky, you might pass out from the sheer agony and the amount of alcohol they've given you, but there's no guarantee you'll even get that small luxury. But of course, it's not just bloodletting and leeches. If you've somehow broken a bone or need some serious medical attention, your options are equally terrifying. The barber surgeon may suggest that you undergo a surgical procedure, where the area will be cut open and your broken bone or infected tissue will be exposed to the elements. You hope that you'll survive the operation. You pray you won't be infected in the process. And of course, if you're unlucky, you may even be amputated, and all of this is done without the luxury of anesthesia, meaning you'll feel every horrific moment. If you don't die from the procedure, there's still a high chance you'll catch something from the sheer lack of hygiene. If you survive the infection and don't lose a limb, congratulations, you might just make it out of this nightmare with your life. In Tudor Britain, living was a battle, and staying alive was a matter of sheer luck. Let's talk about the public health situation for a moment, because health is a term that gets used loosely in this context. You live in a world constantly under siege by unsanitary conditions, where the streets are as much a battleground as your home. It's not uncommon to wake up and realize that you've been sharing your bed with fleas that have hopped from your body to the straw mattress, and if you're lucky, the rats have just made their morning appearance. If you're unlucky, you'll be invaded by lice as well, and that's just the beginning of your day. You'll spend hours trying to get rid of the itching and scratching that come with the inevitable plague of pests that accompany your every moment. But let's not forget about the most vicious enemy, the plague. It's a constant threat in your daily life. You don't know when it'll strike or where it'll come from, but you do know one thing: it's always there, lurking like a death sentence on the horizon. The rats bring it, the fleas carry it, and the unsanitary conditions in your town help it spread with lightning speed. You don't know when the next plague will break out, but you can feel the tension building each time someone near you coughs a little too loudly or starts looking a little too pale. If the plague does come, there's no way to escape it. Quarantines are as useless as the prayer your neighbors offered before the epidemic started. People drop like flies, and the city's response to it is as half-hearted as it is ineffective. Quarantine doesn't mean being shut in your house to avoid contamination. It means nailing your door shut with a red cross painted on it and praying that the disease doesn't kill you in your sleep. It's not an official quarantine system, more like a village tradition of leaving people to fend for themselves while the town moves on to deal with the next disaster. The bodies pile up quickly, and the streets fill with the stench of death, which, somehow, becomes just another part of your daily life. You can barely smell the rotting flesh anymore. It's become such a constant presence. And of course, there's no escape from the rats and fleas, those relentless companions of your existence. If you're lucky enough to live through one plague, there's always another one waiting. A new wave of sickness can arrive without warning, another outbreak, another round of death and decay. You just keep surviving through the unbearable stink of rotting bodies, the ever-present threat of disease, and the constant burden of knowing that no one, not the nobles, not the peasants, is safe from the horrors of Tudor public health. Food, in Tudor Britain, was both a lifeline and a source of relentless, gnawing disappointment. When hunger strikes, which it often does, it is an all-consuming sensation, one that rises from deep within, gnawing at your insides. And when it's time to eat, you're not thinking about variety or flavor, but simply about surviving. The average person's diet could be best described as monotonous survival. The bread, dark and coarse, may not have the sweetness of fruit or the richness of meat, but it's filling, at least for now. You tear a chunk of it off, and immediately your teeth meet a texture so harsh it feels like chewing on cardboard, but you swallow anyway, because what else can you do? You're hungry, and this is what there is. The bread doesn't offer much more than filling your stomach, but it does so with a stubbornness, a thickness that coats your insides. Bread is the staple, the foundation of your every meal, from dawn to dusk. If you're lucky, it's barley or rye. If you're not, it's the kind of bread that makes your jaw ache just from trying to chew it. The bread, rough and hard on the outside, is all you've got. But you're not alone. This same bread defines the world around you, the world of peasants, laborers, and commoners. It's all you can afford, and truthfully, it's more staple than luxury. There are no extravagant grains here, no fine wheat, no soft buttery loaves like the ones you might see in the homes of the rich. The smell of freshly baked bread wafts through the air, but it's not the same as the heavenly scent of something luxurious. It's the smell of necessity, of hunger defeated, of your body tricked into thinking it's had enough. The bread is thick, dense, and probably made with flour that hasn't been sifted in who knows how long. You look down at your hands, covered in coarse crumbs, and wonder how many other people are eating this very same bread. Maybe in a room not so different from your own, a dark, humid place, filled with the stench of humanity. The drink that comes next is a relief, if only for a moment. You've grown accustomed to the daily ritual of ale for breakfast, just as you've grown accustomed to everything else in this world. Ale, not coffee or tea, and certainly not fruit juice. Ale, the drink of survival, is the only beverage that's even close to safe. The water around you is often contaminated, teeming with bacteria and filth, and if you drink it, you risk not just dehydration but illness. So ale it is. You sip it, the sharp, yeasty taste spreading over your tongue. It's thick and brown, the color of mud, but it's liquid at least. It's a far cry from the refreshing beverages of the modern world, but it serves its purpose. It's a social drink too, shared with family, friends, or anyone who has a moment to spare between the hard work of the day. This is the reality of the average diet, a world where bread and ale are your constant companions, and meals are things you have to endure, not enjoy. The fruit, the good stuff, the kind of food that might bring a smile to your face, is scarce. It comes seasonally, and when it does, it's a treasure that you savor, but only for a fleeting moment. Berries, apples, pears, fruits that are meant to sweeten your day are rare, and if you're lucky enough to get them, you savor them like a king. But the abundance is short-lived, and after that, you go back to the reality of no fruit, or what feels like no fruit at all. The ground is full of mud, and the farms are far from prosperous. The fruits are small and sour, often overripe before you can even enjoy them. And the few vegetables you can get are starchy root vegetables that grow beneath the earth, where it's dark and cool, just like the life you lead. Carrots, onions, turnips, and leeks. They are what you can afford and what the soil can offer. You eat them in stews or with your bread, but they are not the colorful, vibrant, diverse vegetables of modern gardens. There's no room for luxury in your diet. There's no room for choice. What's grown is what's eaten, and that's just how it is. And if you don't grow it yourself, you might not get to eat it at all. The land has its limits, and so do your stomachs. The idea of eating fresh produce seems like a dream, something to long for, but not a reality. The garden, if you even have one, has to stretch its bounty throughout the year. The idea of eating seasonally isn't a lifestyle choice. It's the law of the land. When autumn hits, the fruits and vegetables shrivel up, and so does your appetite for anything diverse. But you're not allowed to dream for too long. There's meat, but it's a rare commodity, something reserved for the wealthy or the lucky. Meat is the stuff of special occasions, a dish to show off on festive days. You'll be lucky to have a scrap of bacon, a slice of pork, or if you're in a better position, a few hunks of mutton or beef. But these are luxuries too. Most days, meat is something you hear about, not something you eat. The poor man's diet doesn't include the juicy steak or the roasted fowl of the rich. Instead, it's a diet of bread, ale, and root vegetables, while the nobles feast on roasted venison, spiced chicken, or succulent beef, fat and tender. Your existence revolves around subsisting on what the land gives and what your body can handle, not about indulging in delicacies. When you look at the lives of the nobles, you're reminded of the unbearable divide between your world and theirs. In their homes, everything is different. Their tables are full, their diets refined. They get the sugar, the exotic fruits, the fine cuts of meat, while you gnaw away at coarse bread and wash it down with thick ale. The smells from their kitchens would be a luxury you can only imagine. In the palace halls, they dine on roast swans, sweet fruits from distant lands, and meats cooked with spices. Your meals are a far cry from that, as you chew on gritty bread and wish for something better. The divide is more than just physical, though it's a constant reminder of the hierarchy that defines everything, including food. If you're a peasant, food is about survival. If you're a noble, it's about symbolic display, showing off your wealth and prestige through what's on your plate. They may dine on beef roasted with exotic spices, while you settle for the cheapest cuts of meat, and on days when food is scarce, even that isn't available. The wealthy will sit at grand tables, surrounded by servants, devouring every bite while you sit with your family, waiting for a single loaf of bread to be divided. What's left over for you isn't a luxury, it's a blessing. Their meals speak of power, while yours speak of survival. And this difference doesn't end with the types of food you eat. The wealthy use food to demonstrate their status, while for you, food is more about survival. The nobles have land, and they grow exotic fruits on it, fruits that never quite arrive in your humble world. Their meals come with spices imported from far-off lands, while you barely have enough to eat. They get to be lavish with their dishes, their tables lined with every conceivable luxury, while you eat in squalor and inequality. Their world is one where food is a sign of wealth, while yours is one of endurance. The food you eat might be bad, but the true luxury is not in what's served, it's in the fact that you're still alive to eat it. And that's the difference. The diet of the peasant, the laborer, and the commoner is essentially defined by their place in society. What they eat is a reflection of their lack of privilege and their ongoing battle to survive in a harsh, merciless world. You are what you eat, or perhaps more accurately, you are what you can afford to eat. And that's just the way it is in Tudor Britain. The hierarchy, the classes, the divide between the rich and the poor is present in every meal, in every gruel-filled bowl, and in every sip of dark ale. You may eat, you may survive, but the world around you doesn't want you to thrive. And so, you settle for what's given to you, hoping for a miracle that will never come. In Tudor Britain, food is not just a basic need, it is a symbol of your place in the world. The bread you eat is not the soft, fluffy kind from the royal courts, but a harsh, coarse reminder of your status as a peasant or laborer, constantly on the edge of starvation. The ale you drink is thick, yeasty, and most importantly, a means to survive in a world where drinking water is a dangerous gamble. The fruit that might have been a sweet treat in another life is just a fleeting hope, something to look forward to when the seasons allow. The meat, if you can get it, is a delicacy saved for those who have enough land, enough wealth, enough power. For you, food is a means of enduring, of fighting off the hunger pangs that seem to be your constant companions. And the difference between your meals and theirs? It's a difference of power, wealth, and status, and it defines every bite you take. To put it simply, fashion is restrictive, impractical, uncomfortable, and yet somehow it proves your worth. The noblemen don't just wear clothes, they wear status, and the material of their garb has little to do with warmth or convenience. Instead, every doublet, every pair of hose, every feathered hat is a small and painful reminder of who they are and where they belong in society. And this is especially true for men whose attire is meant to confine them as much as it's meant to define them. Men in Tudor Britain wear tight hose, so tight that they leave nothing to the imagination, so tight that they might as well have been drawn on with a charcoal pencil. There's nothing casual about these clothes. They don't breathe. They don't move. The hose cling to every part of your legs, your thighs, and your calves like they were designed to keep you immobile. If you were a man of high rank, you'd likely wear padded doublets, thick, stiff vests that squeeze your torso, shaping you into a monument of manliness, though not necessarily in a way that's flattering to your body's natural curves. Padded doublets make your body feel like a sculpture, one that's been carved into something angular and inhuman. The weight of the layers makes breathing feel like an afterthought, and sitting down becomes a game of not suffocating as your torso is pressed between the firm, reinforced fabric and the corset-like strings that tie your clothing shut. And the women, who suffer no less in this system of fashion, are equally confined. The farthingales they wear, those hoop skirts that turn their bodies into wide, unyielding circles, seem designed to make movement impossible. In a world where convenience is a luxury and comfort is reserved for those who can afford to do nothing, the farthingale is the perfect embodiment of societal hierarchy. Every woman who wears one has made an unconscious agreement to be a symbol of her rank, a beautiful, shiny, rigid object that serves little purpose other than to show off how wealthy she is. The bodice, that tight corset-like garment that fits the waist so closely, presses against the ribcage until breathing is a chore. Tight, suffocating, it shapes her body into a silhouette, that was designed by society's standards and not by comfort. You're held together by the lace, stiffened fabric, and cumbersome bones that form the structure of her attire. No woman who wore the bodice could imagine comfort. What was required was restraint, an ever-present reminder of how you were expected to appear and never feel. The collars, too, were rigid, stiff, starched, and wide enough to make you feel as if your head had been encased in a cage. These collars were the aristocratic gilded prisons that framed your neck, drawing attention to your face, your expressions, but also constricting your movement, forcing you to hold yourself in a certain way that aligned with how the society expected you to stand. You can barely turn your head to the side, and if you want to look up, it takes an effort. To wear a stiff collar was to wear a symbol of rank, a heavy, immovable reminder of one's place in the strictest of social systems. What's perhaps more outrageous than the stiffness and inflexibility of these clothes is their maintenance. Hygiene, in the world of Tudor Britain, is a distant dream, and washing your clothes often was both impractical and dangerous. Even noble clothes, which were far more expensive and often made of expensive cloth, were rarely washed. To wash your clothes was to risk shrinking or ruining the material beyond recognition. Instead, people were much more likely to air their clothes by hanging them out, or they'd brush them forcefully, removing dust, dirt, and the smell of human sweat, but nothing could mask the underlying stench that always remained. And so, perfume becomes essential. Heavy perfumes, like sweet oils, rosewater, or lavender, were worn liberally to mask the stench of unwashed bodies. The scent was not only to mask unpleasant odors, but also to make a statement. To smell good meant you were wealthy enough to afford these perfumes and had the leisure to wear them, but it also became a social necessity. The more perfume you wore, the more people would know you were someone important, someone who could afford to mask your own body odor. Whether it was a layer of rose water splashed across your skin or a few spritzes of expensive oil on your collar, the perfume itself was another mark of your status. You weren't just wearing flower-scented oil. You were wearing your wealth on your skin. But there were limits even to that. The lower classes, the peasants, didn't have the luxury of such extravagant perfume. They were forced to rely on the smell of their bodies, with no real way to cover it up. If you could afford perfume, you were at the top of the social ladder. If you couldn't, well, you would stink your way through life. There was no hiding the harsh realities of the life of a laborer or a peasant. It wasn't only the garments you wore that told people who you were. It was the smell you exuded, the grime, the sweat, the dirt, all of which were imbued into your clothes through hard labor, long hours, and a life lived without washing. And then there were the sumptuary laws, which acted as the final word on what you could and couldn't wear based on your social rank. These laws governed everything from the color of your clothes to the fabric they were made from. Want to wear purple? Only the queen or someone of noble status could afford that particular color. It was the sign of true wealth, so you weren't allowed to wear it unless you had earned it. Want to wear silk? The law dictated that only the wealthy could wear such luxurious fabric. If you were caught wearing something you shouldn't, you could be punished, fined, jailed, or subjected to public ridicule. Every piece of clothing was a symbol, a strict, unspoken rule that declared not just your social position but your very identity. If you were born into the lower classes, your clothes reflected your worth: cheap, coarse, and practical. If you were born into wealth, you could wear the finest wool, the softest linen, and the most flamboyant colors. Fashion, in Tudor Britain, was not just about wearing what was in style. It was a battle of status and control. Every tight hose, every farthingale, every padded doublet was a statement. It told the world exactly where you stood, and it made sure you didn't forget it. The strangest thing about fashion in Tudor Britain wasn't how people dressed, but why they dressed that way. It wasn't about comfort. It wasn't about personal expression. It was about keeping your place, no matter how painful that place might be. If you ever had the misfortune of walking the streets of Tudor Britain, prepare to have your senses assaulted in the most unforgiving way possible. Picture it: the uneven, sloping roads, worn down by centuries of constant use, with no paving to speak of. They were nothing like the smooth, cobbled pathways of later eras, the ones we might imagine today, when we think of quaint European streets. Instead, Tudor streets were a chaotic blend of mud, rocks, and the remnants of time's decay. And that's before you even get to the smell. The streets of the towns and cities, especially London, were essentially a giant open sewer, a sprawling mass of filth and refuse that seemed to infect everything it touched. You can imagine the scene. Every morning as the sun rises, or as much as it can through the smoke and fog, the street vendors begin to set up their stalls. But long before that, the early risers, the people who lived in the heart of the city, are already beginning their daily rituals of survival, navigating their way through saturated ground, stepping gingerly to avoid slipping in the muddy mess that will be their path for the rest of the day. Horse dung, human waste, and discarded food scraps accumulate and mix, creating a sodden, sticky mess that no one really has the energy to clean up. Every street corner, every alley, is a patchwork of unpleasantness that makes walking itself feel like an extraordinary feat of patience and endurance. Imagine trudging through this daily muck, trying to avoid stepping into the latest pile of excrement, carefully dodging the occasional rotten fish head, or the remains of some long-forgotten meal that no one has yet had the courage or time to throw away. A few inches of slush might collect at your boots, gradually pulling you deeper into the quagmire. It was all too easy to step into an unspeakable pool of muck, whether human or animal, and that unfortunate soul who did so was simply part of the deal in Tudor Britain. As if the filth wasn't enough to make a person reconsider leaving the house, the challenges of walking were enough to make one seriously doubt the possibility of a peaceful stroll through town. In rural towns, the roads were simply dirt paths at best. In urban areas like London, the most common solution to walking on such unrelenting surfaces was a clever little contraption called Patton's wooden shoe platforms that elevated your feet just high enough to avoid the worst of the muck and grime that coated the streets. These primitive, clunky devices were strapped over your shoes, essentially making it look like you were walking on stilts, with all the grace of a shipwrecked sailor. While the patterns may have helped you avoid the worst of the mud, they did little for your balance. You were raised up just enough to make every step a challenge. The wooden platforms didn't fit very well, and they didn't help you avoid the potholes or uneven cobblestones that seemed to lurk around every corner. They just made walking harder, and blisters from the tight, awkward fit were commonplace. On rainy days, the patterns didn't do much to protect you from the slippery conditions underfoot, so you'd end up stumbling, trying desperately to avoid falling, knowing that your walk through the streets would be uncomfortable at best, embarrassing at worst. However, those who were lucky enough to have patterns didn't exactly have it easy. There was the constant hazard of the livestock roaming freely through the streets. The concept of roads or even sidewalks was still a far-off dream. Animals were everywhere. Pigs, cows, goats, sheep, they all wandered through the streets, often unattended by their owners. The streets were their playground, and you were merely a visitor to their territory. The stench of manure filled the air at every turn, as horses, cows, and other animals made their business right in the path of anyone walking by. Trying to avoid stepping in a cow patty while walking in stiff patterns was a game of luck, with a high probability that you would lose. The worst part? People did not keep their animals penned up. It was the Wild West of livestock roaming, so there were pigs, geese, and sheep often scattering across the streets with no owner to call them back. When the occasional cart rolled through, there was no traffic management, no lanes, no right-of-way. It was a game of chicken, you and the livestock, all of you jostling for space, with no set rules other than survive the street. If you were caught behind a horse-drawn cart, you could forget it. The ruts in the road made it impossible for the cart to move swiftly, while the horses pulled it with the same leisurely pace that the merchants seemed to adopt when they had too much time on their hands. You'd stand there, watching the hours go by, with no hope of getting anywhere soon. And the smells. The stench was truly unrelenting. The dung was bad enough, but the lack of proper sanitation and the free-roaming livestock meant that the air itself was thick with the scent of decay and filth. The summer months were especially brutal. If the heat didn't make you feel sticky and suffocated, the constant aroma of rotten food and sweat in the air would certainly finish the job. You couldn't walk more than a few feet without being hit by a sudden wave of stench that seemed to rise up from the sewers, which, more often than not, were open-air trenches running along the sides of the streets. It was an ever-present reminder of how unsanitary life was in Tudor Britain. The sensory assault was intense. The air was constantly wet and heavy, thick with the smell of decay, rotting organic matter, and, well, everything else that wasn't quite sanitary enough to go unnoticed. You'd hear the clatter of carts against uneven roads, the distant shouting of vendors hawking their wares, the bleating of sheep or the occasional moo of a cow as it walked by. But the worst part of it all was the grind of your feet against the muck. Every step was a reminder that comfort was a luxury of the rich. By the time you reached the end of your journey, whether it was the market or your home, you would be covered in dirt, your shoes caked in a mix of mud, animal waste, and the grime of the city. The only consolation was that everyone else around you was in the same state. So long as you didn't step in anything too foul, you could consider your walk a success. The lack of sanitation infrastructure was the true killer in the urban design of Tudor Britain. There were no sewers, no drains for the waste that built up from human and animal activity. Everything went straight into the street. And because people were constantly spilling out of their homes, houses crammed together like sardines, there was nowhere for waste to go but straight into the open air. It would build up around you like a stench-filled wave, washing over your senses and suffocating your spirit. At times, you had to wade through ankle-deep muck just to get to the market or your place of work. City planning was non-existent. Roads were a mess, the infrastructure was non-existent, and there was no one to maintain it. Everything, human, animal, refuse, got mixed together in a way that makes modern sanitation systems look like magic. And those few who were responsible for maintaining cleanliness, for trying to do what they could, were fighting a losing battle. You could try to sweep the streets, but the filth just kept coming back. To walk the streets of Tudor Britain was a grim experience. It was a place of chaos, dirt, and noise. It was a place where the human race existed side by side with animals, decay, and the overwhelming stench of life's hard realities. Each step you took was a reminder of how fragile you were in a world full of unforgiving conditions. But at least you weren't the only one trudging through the muck. If there's one thing that defined life in Tudor Britain, it was the rigid social hierarchy, a structure so unyielding and absolute that it would be difficult for even the most determined to escape its grasp. Imagine living in a world where your social rank was determined not by merit, talent, or even your own efforts, but by the family into which you were born. Your identity, your worth, your entire existence was defined by a complex web of rank, wealth, and status. And for most people, there was no escape. This was a society where movement from one class to another was nearly impossible, and once you were born into a station, that was your life's trajectory. At the very top, towering above all else, was the monarch, the ruler who held absolute power over the kingdom, who could make and break laws, who controlled the fates of nobles and peasants alike. The monarch was considered to be appointed by God, a divine ruler whose decisions were as sacred as they were final. The Tudor monarchy, especially under figures like Henry VIII and Elizabeth I, projected an image of infallibility. The king or queen's word was law, and in their eyes, no one was truly equal. Beneath them were the nobles, the highest of the landed gentry who ruled over vast estates, had access to the king, and lived lives of extravagance and privilege. They were the landlords, the ones with the money, the houses, the servants, and the titles. Nobility came with its own privileges, but it also had its burdens. A nobleman was expected to display a certain level of piety, wealth, and decorum, in accordance with the expectations of the time. These people were far removed from the masses, but the gentry, the class below them, were still tied to wealth, land, and titles, though perhaps not to the same extent. Members of the gentry were typically landowners, but their wealth was not as abundant, and their power was not as absolute. Merchants also belonged to this class, though their economic status was often in flux. Wealthy merchants had the potential to be as influential as some lesser gentry, but they had to earn their status rather than inherit it. Many merchants were self-made men and women, whose wealth came from the growing trade in the kingdom. While their wealth could be significant, they were still often socially inferior to the old aristocracy, no matter how much gold they accumulated. The next layer in the pyramid was the commoners, the backbone of Tudor society. These people could be craftsmen, laborers, or small-scale farmers, and their lives were a daily grind of hard work and struggling to survive. Commoners were born into their position, and despite their best efforts, there was little chance for them to ever move upward. The fact that these people worked hard, maintained families, and contributed to society was irrelevant when it came to class status. They were expected to live modestly and without pretension. They ate the same simple foods, wore basic clothing, and worked day in and day out without much hope for a better future. It was a life marked by constant toil with little reward. The peasants made up the largest group in Tudor Britain. These were the people who worked the land, most of them living on farms that were controlled by land-owning nobles. They were the poorest of the poor, often subject to harsh working conditions, minimal wages, and long hours in the fields. They had few rights, if any at all. For peasants, daily life was a battle for survival. But it wasn't just the work that kept them down, it was the lack of mobility. A peasant born on the land of a nobleman was essentially tied to that land for the rest of his life. He could not leave without the permission of his lord. It was the same for the craftsmen in the towns. If you were born a blacksmith or a weaver, that would be your trade for life. You had little to no chance of becoming a merchant, let alone a noble, even if you earned enough to buy yourself a new title. You were, for all intents and purposes, stuck. This stark class divide was reinforced in several ways. One of the most visible ways was through clothing. Fashion in Tudor Britain was not about self-expression, individuality, or comfort. No, it was all about status. The wealthier you were, the more layers of extravagance and opulence you could afford. Nobles and gentry wore fine silks, velvet, and furs, all while being careful to display their wealth through intricate patterns, rich colors, and precious jewels sewn into their attire. These people wore elaborate outfits that had little to do with function or warmth and everything to do with status signaling. Even their hats were meticulously crafted to indicate their social standing. The higher your status, the larger or more decorated your hat. By contrast, the commoners and peasants wore rough, plain clothing, made from simple wool and linen. Their clothes were designed for utility, not for displaying wealth. The cut of their garments was simple, often ill-fitting, and always practical. The color of their clothing reflected the availability of dyes. A commoner might wear dull browns, grays, or other earth tones, while the nobility paraded in rich, deep colors that were not easily accessible. This was the most immediate visual cue for class clothing. It was not just a matter of practicality, it was the ultimate indicator of your place in society. Beyond clothing, the laws of the time, known as sumptuary laws, actually dictated what each class could wear. These laws were designed to prevent common people from emulating the noble classes and ensuring that everyone knew their place. These rules were strict and unforgiving, and if you were caught wearing something inappropriate for your rank, you could face harsh punishments. These laws regulated everything from fabrics to colors, down to the embellishments that could be used on garments. A commoner who tried to wear a purple gown or a fur-lined cloak could find themselves severely reprimanded by local authorities, if not thrown in prison. These laws were a clear reminder that in Tudor society, you were defined by what you wore, and that the boundary between classes was unbreachable. Social mobility was practically non-existent for the vast majority of the population. If you were born a peasant, there was no way to break free from that role. Land ownership was everything, and most peasants didn't have enough wealth to even buy land, let alone join the ranks of the merchants or nobles. Even if you worked hard, even if you saved, even if you created something extraordinary, there was no route for upward movement. You couldn't buy your way into nobility or climb to the top of the social ladder. Your status was set in stone the moment you were born, but it wasn't just birthright that kept people in their place. The church played a significant role in reinforcing the social hierarchy. The Catholic Church was deeply intertwined with the structure of power and social order in Tudor Britain. Religious belief reinforced the notion that social inequality was part of God's plan. The doctrine of divine right dictated that the king ruled by God's will, and the nobility and clergy were seen as the privileged class, appointed by God to serve as the moral and spiritual leaders of society. The church played a dual role, not only in spiritual matters but also in social control, reinforcing the hierarchy through sermons, religious rituals, and even the law. The church's influence was so powerful that it even regulated aspects of social behavior: who you could marry, what you could own, and how you were expected to behave in public. Heresy, or the questioning of church doctrine, was a serious crime, and those who dared challenge the established social order could be burned at the stake or excommunicated. The fear of eternal damnation was enough to keep most of the population subservient to their station. The priests and bishops were key enforcers of this doctrine, and their influence over the king and nobles ensured that the social order remained intact. The church not only reinforced the status quo but also acted as a barrier to any attempts to reform or challenge the established system. Religion kept everyone in line, from the peasant to the noble. For the commoners, the church was an important community center, but it also ensured that they remained in their place. It wasn't just about salvation, it was about obedience. The idea of equality was far from anyone's mind, and the church made sure that it stayed that way. The poverty of the lower classes was justified by religious teachings that promised eternal rewards for suffering. If you worked hard and endured your lot in life, you would be rewarded in heaven. But of course, that reward was far off, and in the meantime, the status quo would remain unchallenged. The church's authority helped preserve a structure that made rebellion against the hierarchy seem unthinkable. The church reinforced submission, ensuring that every person knew their place in the grand scheme of things. Even those who had small opportunities to better their status were bound by invisible shackles, told they were to serve, and in return, their loyalty would be rewarded. The Tudor class system was a fate that most people never even questioned. The monarch could break the law, the nobles could enforce it, the gentry could protect their wealth, and the peasants would forever remain tied to the land, trapped in the endless cycle of hard work and poverty. Through clothing, law, and religion, the Tudor social hierarchy was as solid as stone and as unyielding as time itself. No matter who you were or how hard you worked, in the end, your social class determined your life. It was a hierarchy that persisted with brutal consistency, unchallenged for the most part because it was God's will, and nothing could be done to change it. In the world of Tudor Britain, work wasn't just something you did to pass the time, it was life itself. From the moment you woke up, if you were lucky enough to make it through the night, you were bound to the labor that kept you alive. There was no such thing as leisure time for the peasants and tradespeople of Tudor society. Theirs was a life of endless toil, and often no reward. Every day was about survival, surviving the harsh weather, the punishing workload, and the very real threat of poverty, illness, or worse. For many, it was the same routine, day after day, a never-ending grind that never let up. Work in Tudor Britain wasn't just a necessity, it was a way of life, a constant state of action and labor, with no breaks, no holidays, and certainly no escape. For peasants working the land, life was entirely centered around the seasons. The growing seasons, the harvesting seasons, the slaughtering seasons, these were not mere periods of time. They were the lifeblood of the economy, and the clock by which every action, every decision, every move in the field had to be made. Spring meant planting. Summer was the long, blistering stretch of sweat-soaked work under the sun. Autumn was harvest, and winter was a time to prepare and wait. There were no weekends, no holidays, no vacations for most peasants. The grind was relentless. Tradespeople, like blacksmiths, weavers, cobblers, and carpenters, faced a slightly different version of the same fate. While they didn't have the land to work, they had their craft, and it required their constant attention. A weaver's loom, a cobbler's shop, or a blacksmith's forge weren't just tools. They were extensions of the craftsman's very existence. These people worked from dawn to dusk, often well beyond, to meet the demand of their trade. Blacksmiths might hammer away at hot metal in the heat of the forge, shaping iron into tools or weapons for farmers, soldiers, or townspeople. Weavers spun wool into cloth, turning raw material into something useful for the clothes, tapestries, and sails that kept Tudor society functioning. Cobbler's work meant hours bent over shoes that would wear out the moment they were used. And carpenters were tasked with not just building, but repairing the homes that had the misfortune of falling apart too soon. Every craftsman was a perpetual problem solver, their day consumed by the constant demand for their work. They, like the peasants, had no luxury of rest. In fact, If laborers were fortunate enough to rest, it was only when the work was finished, but the work was never really done. A farmer's plow was a year-round tool, and the blacksmith's hammer struck against metal until there was nothing left to forge. And even during the rare moments of respite, work never truly ceased. It was simply a pause, a brief moment where the human body could recover from the rigors of the day, though the mind would never truly rest. It would only be occupied by the fear of not having enough, the fear that the weather might turn, that the harvest might fail, that a disease might claim the crops or the livestock, or worse, the very health of the people themselves. For the poor, rest didn't equal comfort. It was a temporary reprieve from the relentless work that kept them alive. In the Tudor world, there was also the divide of gendered labor, where the responsibilities of women and men were clearly defined and rigidly upheld. Women's work was essential, but rarely acknowledged in the same way that the work of men was. Women were responsible for the household, for the cooking, the cleaning, the spinning of wool, the churning of butter, and the weaving of cloth. In many ways, the home was a woman's domain, and the work that came with it was ceaseless. Women also had the burden of managing childcare, and in a world where infant mortality was high, and childbearing was a life-threatening activity, the stakes were high. When a woman wasn't tending to her children or cooking for her family, she was working the land. If her husband was a farmer, she was often right there alongside him, helping to harvest, planting, and tending to animals. Peasant women didn't have the luxury of rest. They worked alongside the men in the fields, but also performed their domestic duties with no reprieve. But there was a layer of work that was invisible, the work that women did to maintain the family. It was household management, an unrecognized but imperative part of survival. The maintenance of the home, the fires that kept the family warm, the food that sustained them, the clothes that protected them, all of this was a woman's domain. These weren't luxurious tasks. They were laborious, unending jobs that required women to constantly act as managers, caregivers, providers, and protectors of the family unit. For the women in noble households, the tasks were similar, but perhaps a little more structured. They would oversee servants, organize the daily schedule, and maintain the social status of the household. But noble women didn't live in utopia either. While they might have servants and luxurious clothes, their duties were often defined by their position. They were still expected to be perfect mothers, wives, and hosts. Much of their time was spent in the constant performance of the perfect lady, decorating their homes, overseeing the management of staff, and bearing children, not to mention entertaining visitors, managing social status, and ensuring their husband's success. Behind the gold and velvet, women in both peasant and noble households lived a life of unrelenting responsibility. Perhaps the most tragic aspect of Tudor labor was the early exploitation of children. Child labor wasn't just a necessary part of life, it was the cornerstone of many households. Children in Tudor Britain didn't have the luxury of being children. From an early age, they were expected to work to contribute to the family's survival. Boys often worked alongside their fathers, learning the trade, or in the case of peasant children, helping on the farm with the planting, the harvesting, and tending to animals. For girls, the work was just as grueling. But gendered girls helped their mothers in the kitchen, the home, and with the endless task of weaving and spinning wool. But they were also often expected to assist with the care of younger siblings, keeping house and supporting their mother's domestic duties. These children didn't play. They didn't go to school. They worked from dawn to dusk in the endless cycle of labor. This wasn't labor as we think of it today. This was work that demanded physical strength, endurance, and an unimaginable level of sacrifice. Children as young as 5 or 6 could be found helping in the fields, tending to crops or animals, learning the trade of their parents. For wealthier households, children worked in the household, helping with the menial tasks of servants, cleaning, preparing food, and working as apprentices in various trades. But even the nobility didn't escape this. Their children were expected to perform their duties, to be good students of the land, learning their positions in society through work rather than play. In noble households, the work was different, but it was still a grueling routine. Servants were integral to the lives of the rich. They were the backbone of the household, keeping things running behind the scenes. From the footmen who ran errands to the maids who scrubbed the floors, servants were expected to work day and night, without rest, without recognition. The noble household wasn't a domain of leisure. It was a machine of service, and that service was expected to continue day and night. If you were a servant, your day started early and ended late. You were tasked with everything from cleaning the floors to tending the fires, to making sure your masters were well fed and entertained. You might help in the kitchen, work in the gardens, or serve your masters directly. It was a 24/7 commitment. There was no clocking out, no time off. Servants lived a life of constant duty, a life that was bound to serve the whims of the noble household, often in complete anonymity. The sheer number of servants in a noble household often meant that the work was split, but that didn't make it any easier. Every servant had their role, their function, and they were expected to perform it without error, without complaint. In Tudor Britain, work wasn't just about earning a living, it was about survival. It was about performing your role and enduring through the endless demands placed upon you. Whether you were a peasant tilling the soil, a tradesman bending over a forge, a woman managing a household, or a child working before you even knew what play was, Tudor society was built on the labor of the many. The nobles and rulers might wear the clothes of royalty, but it was the work of the people that kept the kingdom from falling apart. In the end, work wasn't just a way of life, it defined the lives of the people. The labor of Tudor Britain was its heart, its bloodline, and its reality. The Tudor period was marked by a severe and theatrical justice system, where punishment was not only a means of correction, but an expression of power and control. The law, often arbitrary and brutal, was used as a tool to keep the masses in line, a reminder that the crown and its agents ruled with an iron fist. Justice in Tudor England wasn't about fairness, it was about making an example of those who defied authority. The public spectacle of punishment was often designed to imprint fear upon the population, ensuring that the very idea of disobedience would be stamped out before it could ever take root. In a world where power and position were everything, the rule of law was more about maintaining a social order that preserved the privileges of the elite than ensuring fair treatment for all. Tudor England's legal system was inhumane, brutal, and often arbitrary. The laws were based on a mix of common law, royal decrees, and church rules, but the implementation of justice varied depending on who you were and what status you held. For commoners, the law was a constant threat that loomed over every aspect of their lives. For nobles and royalty, the law was often more of a suggestion, one that could be manipulated and bent to suit their needs. In a society where the elite could get away with almost anything, the common people were held to standards that were not only unforgiving but often arbitrary, with punishment that ranged from the publicly humiliating to the brutally violent. If you had the misfortune of crossing paths with the law in Tudor Britain, the chances were high that you would find yourself subject to a public punishment. These punishments were not private matters, they were designed to be public spectacles, staged for the entertainment of the crowd and the terror of the offender. The punishments themselves were cruel, degrading, and often disproportionate to the crime. But they served a larger purpose, to remind everyone that the crown, the church, and the nobles were the ultimate arbiters of life and death, and to question their authority was to risk becoming the next public example. Perhaps the most infamous of Tudor punishments were those that occurred in the marketplaces and town squares, where convicted criminals would be subjected to stocks, pillories, whippings, or executions. The stocks and pillories were forms of public humiliation, a punishment that was often reserved for those who had committed relatively minor crimes, such as petty theft or minor offenses like gossip or slander. The offender would be locked in place, either sitting in the stocks with their legs bound or standing in the pillory with their neck and wrists restrained, where they would be exposed to public ridicule and verbal abuse. The crowd was encouraged to hurl rotten food, mud, or even worse at the offender, as a form of catharsis for the community. The very public nature of these punishments was a shameful experience, meant to break the spirit of the offender and act as a warning to others who might consider defying authority. But for more serious crimes, the punishment was far more brutal. Whippings, floggings, and beatings were common, and they were typically carried out in the public square, often by the executioner or another official, with the power to administer corporal punishment. The whipping post was a place of public degradation, where the criminal's body would be lacerated and broken as the crowd looked on. The violence of the punishment was meant to be justified by the nature of the crime. But for many commoners, these punishments were also an expression of class and power. The public flogging or beating wasn't just about the crime, it was about the symbolic violence of reminding the lower classes that they were nothing more than subjects to be punished at the whim of the ruling elite. When the crime was severe enough, it could lead to the ultimate punishment, execution. In Tudor Britain, executions were not only a legal consequence, but a spectacle of power. The most publicly visible executions took place at Tyburn in London, where those condemned to die were taken to the gallows to be hanged. These executions were a public event, with spectators lining the streets and market squares, watching as the condemned were led to their death. For the wealthy, being beheaded was often seen as a less ignoble way to die, while for the poor, fate was usually the hangman's noose, which was a much less dignified form of death. Beheading, however, was often reserved for those of noble birth or high rank, a practice that further emphasized the divide between the elite and the lower classes. The beheading was performed in public, often in front of a large crowd that gathered to watch the execution. But even for nobles, death was not always swift. A badly executed beheading could leave the criminal alive for several agonizing moments, a sign of the imperfection of the executioner and the dehumanizing effect of the punishment. Some beheadings were done with a sharp sword, but others were done with an axe, and the results could be gruesome. In Tudor Britain, beheading was not a dignified death, it was an opportunity for spectacle and the very visible display of the regal authority that oversaw such gruesome events. The executioner's role was one of great power, and their ability to kill quickly or slowly was often the subject of public interest and sometimes mockery. The most serious offenses in Tudor society were those that threatened the monarchy or the church. Treason was the ultimate crime, an offense that could bring about death, torture, and public execution. For the Tudor rulers, who ruled in an age of political instability, treason was a fearful specter, the idea that a subject might plot against them or defy their authority. The Tudor dynasty had been founded on a series of violent political struggles, and the threat of rebellion or overthrow was always a real concern. As a result, treason was punished severely, and anyone who was suspected of disloyalty to the crown could be executed without much proof. The trials for treason were often skewed in favor of the crown, with defendants often confessing under duress or torture. But witchcraft was another form of treasonous crime in Tudor England. Witchcraft was feared and loathed, and any woman or man suspected of practicing witchcraft could be tried, tortured, and executed. In a society where religion and superstition went hand in hand, witches were seen as a threat to both society and the church's authority. Witch trials were often a theatrical affair, with accusations based on little more than rumors, fears, or suspicion. Women, in particular, were often the target of witchcraft accusations. Common women who were seen as different, or who had some degree of power in their communities, were often labeled as witches. The public executions of witches were particularly gruesome. Many were burned at the stake, a slow and agonizing way to die. While punishment was brutal for everyone, the application of law was often highly unequal. In Tudor England, there was a clear divide between the noble class and the commoners when it came to legal matters. The nobles were often immune to the harshest forms of punishment, while the common folk were at the mercy of a system that had little regard for fairness. Commoners were routinely punished with extreme measures, while nobles often got away with murder, treason, or corruption without facing serious consequences. The noble class had privileges that protected them from the full extent of the law. They could purchase their way out of trouble, use influence to sway the outcome of a trial, or simply get away with heinous acts without being brought to justice. Justice, in the Tudor world, was not about fairness, it was about upholding the interests of the elite and protecting the monarchy's power. For the commoner, on the other hand, the law was a constant threat. The legal system was based on a complex network of local laws, royal decrees, and church rules, many of which were interpreted and enforced by local officials who were often just as corrupt and unjust as the system they upheld. Commoners had little recourse against unjust treatment, and many were at the mercy of a system that operated based on privilege and class, rather than any sense of fairness or due process. If you were a peasant, a weaver, or a blacksmith, your fate was largely decided by those in power, and if you found yourself on the wrong side of the law, the punishment would be swift, severe, and publicly humiliating. The Tudor legal system was designed to maintain control through fear. The theatricality of punishment, whether it was the public execution or the brutal beating in the town square, was meant to remind everyone of the power of the crown. Justice, in Tudor England, was about intimidation. It was a tool of control, a means to show the people that their lives were completely at the mercy of the crown. The brutality and public spectacle of the punishments were meant to instill terror and ensure obedience. In a society where status and power were everything, the law was just another weapon in the arsenal of those who ruled. In Tudor England, religion was far more than a matter of personal faith or spiritual devotion. It was the very fabric that wove together the fabric of society, one where your beliefs determined your social standing, your safety, and, quite often, whether you would see the next morning's light. The church, both a religious and political institution, was as omnipresent as the thick fog that blanketed London's streets, as inescapable as the brutal power that coursed through the monarchy. It was the spiritual and secular force, directing the hearts and minds of the people while shaping their daily lives. Church doctrines, at once divinely ordained and manipulated to secure the monarch's iron grip on power, were as crucial to survival as food or water. To question or deviate from orthodoxy was to risk becoming an outcast, labeled a heretic, and there was little mercy in such a label. The church governed more than just religious practice. It held sway over the very soul of the state itself. The Tudor period saw religion rise as the most volatile, treacherous force of them all, a force that could sweep noblemen and peasants alike into the grip of the crown's ever-tightening noose. At the heart of it all lay the person of the monarch, for it was Henry VIII's break with Rome, more than anything, that set the course of religious turbulence for the century to follow. The early years of Henry's reign saw a solid alliance with the Roman Catholic Church, one that he used to bolster his power and solidify his standing as an absolute monarch. But the moment that his desire to secure a male heir collided with Rome's refusal to annul his marriage to Catherine of Aragon, Henry, a man known for his boundless pride, saw no choice but to break from Rome. With a thunderous decree, the Church of England was born not out of theological conviction but as a tool of statecraft. Rome's control over England's spiritual destiny was severed, and Henry, ever the opportunist, seized the title of supreme head of the Church in England, forever intertwining the monarchy and religion in a twisted dance of mutual dependence. What followed, under Henry's reign and the reigns of his successors, would be a century of religious chaos, as doctrines shifted in the breeze, like the flags atop Westminster Abbey. Henry's break with Rome had initiated a process where religion became a tool of the state, a weapon in the hands of rulers whose political motives were, at times, more important than their personal salvation. This was the paradox of Tudor England. Beliefs were shaped, not by the people's faith, but by the whims of kings and queens, often at the expense of the soul. The common people, steeped in centuries of Catholic tradition, found themselves in an alien and frightening new world, one where heresy could be as easily defined by politics as by piety. For the first part of his reign, Henry, despite his zeal for divorce, still maintained much of the traditional Catholic practice in his kingdom. The doctrine of transubstantiation was upheld, and Catholic masses continued. But the sheer monumental shift created by the Act of Supremacy had ripple effects across the realm that would soon become impossible to ignore. Even as Henry broke with Rome, the people were ordered to follow his decree, under threat of death. And so began the Age of Confusion, where Catholicism was no longer an institution, but a political weapon wielded by the monarchy. The mass executions of those who opposed the new state religion were a constant undercurrent of Henry's reign. Catholics, Protestants, and even those caught in between would find themselves at the mercy of an ever-changing religious order. As Henry passed, his son Edward VI, a fervent Protestant, would drive even further reforms. The Book of Common Prayer became the foundation for daily worship, and the old ways were abandoned in favor of a stripped-down faith that emphasized scripture over ritual. But Edward's reign was short-lived, and with his death, England saw a rapid backlash as Mary I ascended the throne. A staunch Catholic Mary sought to reverse her father's religious reforms, and she was unyielding in her conviction. Her reign, though short, became infamous for the burnings of Protestant heretics, the so-called Bloody Mary period, where hundreds of Protestants were burned at the stake in public executions. It was as though England had entered a nightmarish cycle, where one monarch's reforms were undone by the next, and faith became little more than a political lever. But Mary's reign ended in 1558, and with her death, her sister Elizabeth I took the throne. The reign of Elizabeth was to be the zenith of Tudor religious policy, a time when church and state were formally united under the Elizabethan religious settlement. Elizabeth, shrewd and pragmatic, sought to create a compromise, a middle ground between the Catholic and Protestant factions. She declared herself the supreme governor of the Church of England, a title that subtly echoed her father's self-declared supremacy, but with the emphasis shifted from absolute sovereignty to a more pragmatic approach to governance. Under Elizabeth, the Church of England adopted a blended liturgy that included Catholic-style rituals, such as the use of vestments and the emphasis on the sacraments, alongside Protestant-style doctrine, which placed Scripture and individual faith at the center of worship. The Anglican Church, as it would come to be known, was neither fully Catholic nor fully Protestant, but a hybrid of both, designed to unite a fractured nation under a common religious banner. Yet, despite the appearance of religious stability, the tension between Catholicism and Protestantism never fully abated. Elizabeth's religious reforms did not end the persecution of those who deviated from the Church of England, particularly those Catholics who refused to accept Elizabeth as the head of the Church. Recusants, those who refused to attend Anglican services, faced fines and imprisonment, and many were executed for their faith. The Elizabethan era, though marked by prosperity and cultural flourishing, also saw the hunting of Catholic plots against the throne. The fear of Catholic rebellion was ever present in the English court, as the Pope and foreign Catholic powers, most notably Spain, looked to bring England back into the fold of the Catholic Church. The Spanish Armada of 1588, which sought to overthrow Elizabeth, was a manifestation of the religious animosity that had simmered throughout the period. Thus, religion in Tudor England was never just a matter of personal salvation. It was a matter of survival, and those who practiced their faith in ways that were not aligned with the state's religion risked execution. Heresy was not only a sin against God, it was a threat to the state's stability, and so it was treated with the utmost severity. In this context, religion became an inextricable part of the social and political landscape, an all-encompassing force that touched the lives of everyone, from the monarch down to the humblest peasant. Church attendance was mandatory, not only for the salvation of the soul, but as a social obligation. To fail to attend Mass, or worse, to openly profess a belief in anything other than the official religion, could make one a target for surveillance. Priests, who were supposed to be the guides to the faithful, often doubled as informants for the crown. The confessional was a place where secrets were shared, but it was also a place where the confessions of the faithful could be used to turn people in, to root out any hint of subversive thought. The sacrament of confession, which was intended as a means of personal spiritual reflection, had become a tool for state control. In a society where beliefs and loyalties were constantly in flux, the fear of heresy was omnipresent. The accusation of heresy could come from anywhere, from a disgruntled neighbor, from someone with a personal vendetta, or from the state itself, looking for any excuse to rid itself of perceived threats. Heresy trials, like those of the Protestant martyrs burned during Mary's reign, became as much about political control as about theological purity. People were put to death for their faith or lack thereof, and many were forced to recant or face the consequences. This intertwining of faith with survival was particularly evident in the lives of the common people, who were caught between the demands of the church and the pressures of the state. For them, attending Mass and adhering to the official doctrine was not just about seeking salvation, but about ensuring their place within the social order. The Church provided not only spiritual guidance but also practical support through its charitable works, And in a world where poverty was rampant and death was ever present, the church's power was indispensable. In Tudor England, leisure was a strange and uncomfortable affair, a blend of brutal spectacle and crude entertainment, where moments of joy were often intertwined with the dark shadows of death and the harsh reality of life. There was little in the way of comfort or indulgence, and most people found their social outlets in highly public spaces, where entertainment often took the form of humiliating displays or mournful rituals. A walk through the bustling streets of London, where the air was thick with the smells of human and animal waste, would lead you to the public square, where spectacles of violence, pain, and despair were put on for all to see. The first stop for many, even before a tavern, would be the public execution. The gallows or the scaffold was as much a part of the public landscape as the market stalls or the rows of muddy streets. Here, the poor, the rich, and everyone in between came to witness the theatrical final moments of a criminal's life. No longer simply a method of punishment, public executions had evolved into a social event, events of horror and morbid curiosity, where the crowd's thirst for justice and entertainment converged. The death penalty, administered with little procedure or compassion, was a spectacle that attracted crowds, often packed into the narrow streets of cities like London, all to witness the hanging, beheading, or even the drawing and quartering of men and women accused of a range of offenses. It wasn't about justice, it was about control, obedience, and fear. It was a public exhibition of power, as the ruling class used death to remind the masses of their subjugation. On any given day, you could find the square filled with the mournful chants of a priest, the creaking of the gallows, the crowd's anxious murmurings, and, eventually, the sharp crack of a neck snapping or the thud of a body hitting the ground. Whether it was for treason, theft, witchcraft, or even the accusation of heresy, executions were tied tightly to the very fabric of Tudor society. The monarchy understood that the power of spectacle could unite and control. A hanging, for example, would be a show for the people, with spectators gathered to witness the swift judgment that the monarch bestowed on society's miscreants. For them, the gallows was a constant reminder that disobedience would not be tolerated, rebellion would be crushed with ruthless authority, and the people would see justice meted out in full public view. But death wasn't the only form of entertainment in Tudor life. For the more affluent or those looking for more spectacular thrills, there was the brutal sport of bear baiting, a frenzied, often bloody affair, where a bear, chained to a post, was attacked by a pack of dogs. It was a fight to the death, and the audience cheered on the carnage as the bear, its fur matted with blood and dirt, struggled against the dogs gnashing at its flesh. If you had a stomach strong enough, you could witness the gruesome spectacle, where the line between man and beast blurred in a cacophony of growls, barks, and screams. In many ways, bear baiting was a precursor to later modern-day blood sports, a world where violence was not only condoned, but celebrated in a way that was as entertaining as it was deeply unnerving. There was no compassion for the animals involved, nor was there any real sense of ethical reflection on such cruelty. It was simply an opportunity to witness life and death, cruelty and victory, all in a public, unsettling display. Meanwhile, for those who sought cultural rather than physical bloodshed, the theater offered a safer but equally dramatic form of entertainment. The plays of Shakespeare, performed in public theaters like the Globe Theatre, became an iconic part of Tudor social life. The elaborate sets, the grand speeches, and the complex characters drew crowds from all levels of society. But despite the allure of grand tales and tragic narratives, the world of Tudor theater was not one of quiet reflection. The public theater was boisterous, loud, crude, and alive with the hum of spectators' chatter. You could hear hollers, shouts, and jeering from the audience, who would express displeasure or joy as scenes unfolded on the stage. And no performance, whether it was the death of Hamlet or the fall of Macbeth, would be complete without reaction from the crowd. For them, a play wasn't a quiet or reflective experience. It was an active, immersive form of entertainment that engaged the audience in ways that would seem completely foreign to modern theatergoers. Yet, for all the public spectacles, the true entertainment for many of the Tudor folk came in the form of community-based leisure activities. The common people often participated in festivals, where the streets would come alive with the sounds of music, games, and dancing. Whether it was the feasts and gatherings of May Day, with its symbolic maypole dancing, or the tournaments that brought together people from surrounding villages, the Tudor festivals were meant to be a release valve, a temporary respite from the hardships of daily life. For the commoner, these events were about much more than just having fun. They were outlets for communal connection, a chance to celebrate as a society, even if for a short while. The village or town square would often become the setting for games like tug of war, football, or archery, and the competitions were fierce. There was an edge to the friendly rivalry. Pride was at stake, and no matter how harsh life might have been for a peasant, they could claim a temporary sense of triumph when they outperformed others in the games. But beneath the grand spectacle and social gatherings, the romantic lives of the people were often governed by transactions rather than the romantic ideals we might associate with the modern age. In Tudor England, marriage was not primarily a matter of love or affection. It was about alliances and social advancement. For the wealthy, it was a political tool, a way to solidify ties with other noble families or even to gain favor with the crown. A noblewoman's marriage might be arranged years in advance, and the union would be based on securing a legacy, gaining land, or forming alliances with others who wielded influence. For the common folk, marriage still had elements of strategy, though often less grand in scope. To marry was to secure one's future, to have children who could work the land and continue the family's legacy. Yet, even in the most humble of marriages, love often played a part, but it was love woven into a pragmatic, sometimes cynical, fabric. In such a harsh world, where the physical and emotional needs of the human body were often neglected in favor of survival, people turned to perfume and cosmetics as a means of masking the sweat and dirt of their lives. Bathing, as we understand it today, was a luxury for the wealthy, and even they bathed infrequently, using oils and perfumes to mask the unpleasant odors of the body. The more affluent could afford to invest in cosmetics, such as white lead powder for their faces, a product that gave the skin a pale, almost ghostly appearance, signaling both beauty and high status. The very act of perfuming oneself was a way of distancing oneself from the grime and struggles of daily life, creating a veneer of status and refinement. But for the common folk, who rarely had access to clean water or basic soap, it was simply a matter of survival. A spritz of lavender or a handful of herbs in their hair helped them cope with the stench of poverty, the endless grime of living in filth, and the overpowering odors of a society with little means to clean itself. The Tudor period in Britain was one of extremes. It was a time marked by immense struggle, both physical and emotional, where every day was defined by survival against the backdrop of a society that was as brutal as it was beautiful. Life in Tudor Britain was shaped by harsh conditions, where survival was not a guarantee, and every aspect of daily life, be it health, comfort, or sustenance, was determined by one's social status. Whether you were born into the splendor of royalty or the grinding poverty of the peasantry, your place in this world would be rigidly enforced by a system that offered few paths for escape. In this world, the most basic human needs were shaped by the whims of birth. Hygiene was a luxury for the wealthy, while the poor lived surrounded by the stench of unclean streets, rat-infested homes, and a world that seemed designed to ensure survival for only the fittest. Food was dictated by your class, with the nobles enjoying the luxury of rich meats, fine pastries, and wine, while the peasants subsisted on coarse bread, gruel, and whatever scraps they could scavenge. The very air you breathed in Tudor England could be a cause of death, infected by the plague, or tainted by the smoke and stench of a society with no concept of sanitation. Disease was rampant, and death was never far away, whether it came from the Black Death's periodic return, the cruelty of a barber surgeon's tools, or the ever-present threat of execution for a misstep. Yet, despite these overwhelming hardships, the spirit of Tudor Britain was not easily crushed. There was a resilience, a determination to endure, and perhaps most of all, a stubbornness that allowed the culture of the time to thrive, even in the face of death and despair. The Tudor society, for all its failings and cruelties, was not simply a place of suffering. It was also a society filled with remarkable feats of human spirit, creativity, and cultural ingenuity. The arts flourished, and the Tudors themselves were avid patrons of culture. The reigns of Henry VIII, Mary I, and Elizabeth I saw a blossoming of music, literature, and theater that would leave an indelible mark on the history of Western civilization. Shakespeare and his contemporaries transformed the theater, turning it from a public spectacle into a profound cultural experience that engaged the intellect, the emotions, and the imagination of those who attended the plays. These works were not just about entertainment, they were a way for society to process its own existence. Life in Tudor Britain was difficult and often cruel, but through the catharsis of theater, song, and literature, the people found a means of escape, reflection, and expression. Even in the darkest corners of society, where the poor lived in squalor, the resilience of the human spirit could not be easily extinguished. Music, games, and festivals allowed people to come together, to share their joys and sorrows, and to create moments of camaraderie that transcended the oppressive structures of society. These were not mere distractions. They were a way of asserting identity, of defying the harshness of daily life, and of reclaiming control over one's own existence. The common folk, though they had little in the way of physical comforts, enjoyed the satisfaction of community, shared tradition, and collective joy. Marriage and romance in Tudor Britain were often transactional, with alliances being forged for the sake of family power, land, and dynastic survival. Yet even within this rigidly structured society, the human desire for affection and companionship persisted. There were moments of genuine love, even if they were overshadowed by the larger machinery of politics and status. Social status, then, was both a defining feature and an oppressive burden in Tudor Britain. It determined who you could marry, what you could wear, where you could live, and even the food you could eat. The nobility lived in luxury, with their elegant clothes, sumptuous feasts, and sprawling estates, while the common people struggled daily just to survive, their lives dictated by the land they worked, the clothes they wore, and the jobs they could find. But status wasn't just about material wealth, it was a matter of visibility, of what you could say and how you could say it without fear of reprisals. Speaking out of turn, or daring to question authority, could lead to exile, imprisonment, or even death. This sense of unequal justice was a pervasive element of Tudor life, a constant reminder of the hierarchies that governed society. Law, for the common person, was an instrument of oppression, meting out punishments that were often brutal and arbitrary. The very idea of fairness was a luxury reserved for the privileged few, and the poor were at the mercy of a system that did not value their lives as much as it did the lives of those with money, land, or power. Whether it was a minor crime, a charge of witchcraft, or the accusation of treason, the judicial system was as draconian as it was theatrical. Public executions, floggings, and branding were not simply means of punishment. They were tools for maintaining control, reinforcing the social order, and ensuring that the ruling classes could remain unchallenged. But despite the brutality, the Tudors endured. They created a world where, even in the worst of times, there were flickers of hope, moments of joy, and spaces for resistance. Culture and tradition were vehicles for this resilience, allowing the people of Tudor England to find meaning in their lives, even when survival was the ultimate goal. For all the hardship and suffering, life in Tudor Britain was also a testament to the enduring spirit of humanity, to the drive to make sense of the world even in the face of seemingly insurmountable obstacles. As brutal as it could be, the Tudor period was also a time of cultural flourishing, social transformation, and political upheaval that would shape the future of England for centuries to come. From the reign of Henry VIII, with his break from the Catholic Church and his creation of the Church of England, to the Elizabethan era, where the arts, literature, and exploration flourished, Tudor Britain played a pivotal role in shaping the course of European and global history. Tudor life was a story of contrasts, cruelty and creativity, oppression and rebellion, suffering and survival. It was a society that, despite its rigid structure, its legal inequities, and its crushing poverty, produced a culture that would outlast its own era, continuing to influence generations long after the last Tudor monarch had passed from the throne. Despite everything, the legacy of Tudor Britain endures not only in its monuments, its art, and its architecture, but in the spirit of its people, a spirit that refused to be broken, a spirit that adapted, created, and ultimately thrived in the face of unimaginable adversity. In the end, life in Tudor Britain was defined not by hardship, but by the inextinguishable human will to survive and to create amidst the most grueling conditions. Tudor England was not just a land of suffering and violence. It was a place where the people managed to carve out spaces for themselves, where they found ways to live, love, and laugh, even in a world that seemed determined to make them suffer. The Tudor story, then, is not simply one of survival, but of the resilience of the human spirit in a time that tested it at every turn.